So welcome to this session on breaking barriers, building connections, how to achieve synergy between the fields of peace building, climate change, environment, and food security. That's a lot. So my name is Celestine Proctor. I am the chair of the working group for AFP on climate change, environment, violent conflict, and peace. That's also a lot. So today, with us on the panel, we've got Carl Brook from the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. He's also Director of International Programs at the Environmental Law Institute, and also Ted Holmquist, the Peace and Conflict Director for Mercy Corps. We may also have Porter Bury joining us from Dexus. We will confirm that later during the session. So just to give a little bit of background, this conversation is obviously, it covers a wide range of topics, looking at that intersect between climate change, environment, peace building, and food security. It comes at the back of us within the working group that's been running since the end of October-ish last year, where we as a group decided to come together and try and build out a better understanding and develop guidelines and principles for what it might be to work in environmental peace building. What did that actually mean? How did that look? As we worked through as a working group as to what we actually meant by that and what did the framework mean for that, we kind of came to the conclusion that we needed to unpack a lot more of it. We understood that there's obviously different branches related to climate security, related to ecological security, related to environmental security, and the definitions around that are quite complex, but also interrelated. So as a group, we've been challenged in trying to come up with common definitions as to how we talk about what we mean in this space, and how do we then speak the same language using that. We wanted to try and come up with those common definitions in order to develop what the best guiding practices might be for working in any one of those three spaces, and promote learning in either environmental security, climate security, or ecological security, and how did that translate across the different sections. But as I said, we've had a lot of challenges in trying to initially come up with those definitions and also constrain what we're talking about so it doesn't get too big. But what we found was that climate, food security, environment, and conflict prevention, as well as peace building, they all overlap and they're continually shifting. There's a need to take an adaptive and strategic approach to consider all of those factors in terms of multi-factor programming and what that might look like. So with no further ado, I am going to start by asking Carl a few questions, or one by one, but we won't bombard him. And with that, so we see this lumping together of and apologies, I am reading, so we see this lumping together of environmental and climate considerations in these discussions. You run the Environmental Peacebuilding Association and direct international programs at the Environmental Law Institute. What are the tensions that you observe between environmental and climate considerations, especially relating to conflict prevention?
Thank you, Celestine, and thank you for the opportunity to join. I do see that there's often a kind of a lumping together of climate change, environment, natural resources, food security. There are different challenges. Some of them go to the groups that are involved. So the Ministry of Environment might be more responsible for climate change, where the Ministry of Water and Ministry of Fisheries might be responsible for specific resources, Ministry of Ag responsible for food security. So there are different institutions, they have different mandates, they have different values. Some are more focused on use, others on conservation, others on preservation. Some are more anthropocentric, some are more ecocentric. So there are different questions that come up because of the different mandates and the different philosophical orientations. But that said, I think that the tensions historically have tended to be more between kind of the environment, climate, natural resource, food security on one hand, and peace, conflict, and security on the other. And it goes both ways. Historically, there's been a big reluctance on the part of peace, conflict, and security actors to consider environment and climate change. These are the things that you worry about once you have peace, and to kind of pile on to the Christmas tree all the environmental and climate change requirements just slows peace down and unnecessarily this is kind of a historic view. That's not something you worried about until you had peace. That's changed dramatically over the last 15 years. And I remember it was like a light switch went off. And part of it was that when we were talking about this, like in 2006, 2007, there really was an interest. And then when people realized, oh, we're talking about natural resources, oh, that has clear links to peace. Those are inputs, those are contexts. We need those to provide for livelihoods, to provide jobs. A lot of the economies, both at the local level and at the national level, are dependent on natural resources. And so there really started to be a shift in the perceptions of the peace, conflict, and security community. There's still work to be done on that, but I'm very happy to say we've come such a long way in that respect. On the other hand, the environmental community, I would say, particularly those that work on climate change, have a big blind spot when it comes to peace, conflict, and security. Part of it is that, they're working on what is arguably the existential threat to our country, to the worldwide economy, to peace. This is a huge, huge threat. And it doesn't ever cross their mind that they could be doing bad, that they could be creating problems. And some of this came up recently. I was talking with an organization that was working on deep decarbonization. And the question that I had was, what does this mean for the countries? And there are arguably 20 or more countries that depend substantially on revenues from fossil fuels for stability, for their social compact. What does deep decarbonization mean for stability of these countries and for civil war? And they didn't have an answer. This wasn't something they were thinking about. And I mean, to be frank, some organizations in the climate change community are working on just transition. This one wasn't. But the response that I got, a couple of responses, well, you have to start somewhere. You have to do something. If you looked at all the impacts, you'd be paralyzed. Yes, but the problem is you could also create big new problems that are even bigger than we're facing now. And I think that the environmental community is very cautious in many of the institutions about getting too involved in peace, conflict, and security issues. And I think that we also see this with adaptation, the history of conservation and moving people out of areas that are deemed to have high environmental values. And then we see it also on the process side, not just on the values, but on the process side, where there is a desire to move quickly, to put in place a lot of renewable energy, and do so to waive environmental impact assessment and zoning requirements just to make this happen, because we don't have time to spare. This is urgent. This is urgent. And I think that urgency generates real risks that a lot of organizations still have not come to grips with. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. You raised some good points there about that tension between needing to move quickly, especially in terms of greenhouse gases and the pressure to obviously reduce carbon emissions, and how that then might play out. I may circle back to you with a follow-up question, but I'll move on to the second question. What is the value of differentiation of language, and where should we focus simply on shared objectives when integrating our programming?
Definitions and differentiation of language can be one of the hardest things to do. And I will add to this, it's not just definitions in English. How do you translate this to other languages, where it's not just a word choice, but these are conceptual ideas that you're trying to translate into other languages, where there might not be a good direct translation. I came to this space from an experience working first on the environmental consequences of war, then working on post-conflict peacebuilding, natural resource management. And in that context, we saw a lot of linkages between the dynamics and actions that happened across the life cycle. What happened before the conflict, the contributing causes to conflict, how environment and natural resources drove conflict or financed conflict or were targeted during conflict, or just became a casualty of a lack of governance and lack of government presence, to the peace agreements and what happened afterward. So from the beginning, I've taken a broad view. And part of this is that a lot of institutions have very stovepiped mandates, whether it's on what they do, what their objectives are, or when they act, in terms of well, we only work during conflict. We only work on peace agreements. We only work on post-conflict. And so, but you see that the actual dynamics in a country, are linked, especially when it comes to natural resources. And so, for my purposes, I've been working with some others on a definition that is very broad, a meta framework comprising multiple approaches and pathways by which management of environmental issues is integrated in and can support conflict prevention, mitigation, resolution, and recovery. And I'd like to just briefly show a figure that illustrates this. And I think that it's, okay, can you see that? So this says conflict prevention, early warning, and interventions to what happens during conflict, and efforts to mediate and negotiate. And then you have a peace agreement and post-conflict, the peacekeeping and the peace building and the transition to sustainable development. And across the conflict life cycle, we see risks, and these are shown in red, whether it's bad governance, causing tensions and grievances, to financing of armed conflict, blood diamonds, blood timber, blood bananas, anything that generates a revenue stream can be exploited by rebels. And it's usually rebels because they don't have access to taxation and other sources of financing, especially after the end of the Cold War. But you see, these are the different negative dimensions, the negative implications of natural resources on conflict. And these, by contrast, are the opportunities. And I say this because I find that having a broad general definition, first of all, this allows us to look at the linkages across time and how land may have been the cause of conflict, inequitable land distribution that was then, there was land grabbing during the war, and in the peace agreement, one of the provisions may have to do with reintegration of ex-combatants and providing land for ex-combatants to have a peaceful livelihood. And then the whole question of what happens to that afterwards, so kind of looking across that life cycle is really important. And then, but having a broad definition, then having more descriptive elements that describe how do the different institutions and people and actors see natural resources in this broader context. And I think that that's having a very precise definition. It can be challenging because everybody has their own things that they need in there. Having something broad allows for what I think Kissinger referred to as constructive ambiguity. And so I'll stop sharing that figure there, but I did want to note that some definitions focus on particular elements, like the cooperation side, bringing people together to cooperate around shared interests in the environment, sometimes focusing on environment in the peacemaking process, the negotiations, sometimes focusing only on post-conflict peace building. So I think that there are a lot of people who have very specific contexts. I find it useful to kind of engage them all in that broader discussion. The final thing I would say is that there are a number of questions in this space. And I think it's an ongoing debate, and it will forever be an ongoing debate about, is this included? Is this necessary? But I just want to highlight a couple of the questions that I'm seeing. So one is, are environmental peace building interventions necessarily conflict sensitive? That is to say, if it's not conflict sensitive, does that mean it's not an environmental peace building intervention? I personally believe that there are a lot of interventions that use natural resources to build peace, but themselves, ironically, are not conflict sensitive. They don't. So I think that that's something to be looking at. Another question is, what does conflict sensitive programming mean? Does it go beyond do no harm? Does it necessarily have to have elements that build peace positively? There is a split opinion here, but I'll just highlight that those are questions. And the final thing I would say is, it's really good to have these discussions because there are a lot of different people approaching this from different perspectives, whether it's political science or law or anthropology or geography, and they use different tools. They have different understandings. And in having that debate, you start seeing different dimensions. You go, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. And so I think it's really good to have that robust debate. I also think, as your question alludes, Celestine, at some point, we want to keep moving forward. It's good to have the discussions, but being paralyzed by the debates over, well, does it include this? Does it include that? I would say, yes, it includes all of these. And let's talk about how we can do better, but let's not get too bogged down necessarily in all of the debates that would preclude us from moving forward in the meantime and continuing to learn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl. That was really helpful and a really good framing of both that. I was particularly interested you're highlighted of your 3 questions in this space. I think that you've nicely put 3 of the most important, but as you've rightly say, there's a lot more questions in this space. So with that, I'll move on to Ted from some additional questions. And then Carl, I'll circle back to you with any questions from participants, as well as potentially some of my own. So Ted, you've been involved with the Ideal activity, specifically developing a report released in January, integrating conflict sensitivity into food security programs. Based on that report, how do you see the integration of conflict sensitivity and food security fall into this conversation?
Yeah, thank you very much, Celestine. And just to briefly introduce myself, for those who don't know, my name is Ted Holmquist, and I'm a Director for Peace and Conflict on Mercy Corps' Technical Support Unit. And I'm sorry my video is not working. I wish that you were able to see me, but we had some tech issues that we unfortunately were not able to resolve. But yeah, coming to your question, Celestine, we started working on this learning brief actually around the time of the start of the war in Ukraine, and it was not started in response to that, but that was another case where we really saw at a global level the link between conflict and food security, as we saw food supplies and food prices heavily affected by war there. Now, our brief was intended to look at a much more local and program level and how food security programming and conflict interact. And the brief was developed over a number of months, primarily by speaking with implementing partners of USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, both on the food security side and those who had a specific focus on conflict within some of those partners. And we open the brief, we try and kind of to begin present some of the positive and negative examples of how food security programs can have an impact on conflict. So one that's most commonly known is that if you're working on a cash or a food distribution to certain groups, that can lead to perceptions of inequality if others are not receiving that. And if there are conflict lines predating that, then that can exacerbate those tensions. But however, if you are able to support different groups equitably and in a way that is perceived to be fair, then you can really mitigate the tension. And going beyond that, another element in food security programs worth highlighting is that if you're supporting producer groups or creating agent networks, for example, that if you do that across dividing lines, you can also ease tensions by building in those shared economic interests. But you have to do that very carefully. Again, there's a negative risk that you can, if you're doing that, you can perhaps be perceived as favoring elites. So we really start by presenting a lot of these examples to kind of set the scene and the stage for what we think can be done in these situations. And what we did in the learning brief was to look at general approaches for how you then integrate conflict sensitivity into food security. So coming to Carl's point around what do we mean by conflict sensitivity? Well, this tries to present one view for how that can be applied. And a key area to highlight here is the importance of analysis and conflict sensitivity analysis at the start. But the brief also mentions, typically you might feel that that's kind of a separate exercise, very much in the realm of peacebuilding actors and their specialization. But the brief tries to highlight some food security analysis mechanisms that can be leveraged, such as famine early warning response systems that already investigate conflict dynamics. And you can build an integrated response to food security crises by using analysis like that. Another crucial area we looked at was around targeting in food security programs. And that's often where a lot of tension arises. And we share examples from a number of locations of where you can see some of the risks, but also what can be done about them. And so one example we looked at was in Syria, where in one area, international actors had been expelled by local communities because they felt that the international organizations coming in were too closely linked to one particular side in the conflict. So organizations in response started to make sure that their staff was balanced to represent the local population, and they used community-based participatory approaches for targeting, and that led to much more acceptance and a stronger program. And so overall, the key recommendation from the report is on this front is really that food security programs can be more conflict sensitive by using participatory approaches that emphasize inclusion and empower aid recipients and are based on strong analysis. And that might not be a revolutionary statement in and of itself, but I think the learning brief provides a lot more evidence and information around that, and it's a really critical component to continue working towards. And just a few final thoughts to conclude with. Another key finding and recommendation from the brief was that you should really try and build on what's working at the local level. So for example, in South Sudan, we heard from one organization, an international NGO, that when they provided food and cash assistance to internally displaced persons, that the IDPs who received it would always share that assistance with their host community. So, and they did that to build trust and social and economic connections with those communities. And it was a kind of a deliberate act that made both sides feel more safe in terms of food security and also physical security and the social cohesion in the area. So again, the lesson here is to conduct that analysis, be ready to uncover unexpected outcomes and adapt to them, adapt to what is already being done and strengthen those existing practices. And so ultimately, the learning brief again places this onus on strengthening local ownership, but is not naive about the challenges. And we go into those. We go into the political and social pressure that local actors face, and provide some insight into how to navigate those. And we also acknowledge some of the challenges in applying conflict sensitivity in emergency situations. And so we try and lay out what are some of the minimum standards of conflict sensitivity that you can undertake in an emergency response. So yeah, I'll leave it there. And the report is also is available online, and we can share that link with you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ted. Yeah, I'm sure that people will appreciate the link to the report as well, especially with reference to the minimum standards that your research has found with relation to conflict sensitivity. So with that, I'll move on to the second question. Can you explain how environmental conflict and climate factors are linked to food security?
Yeah, so building on that, one thing that Mercy Corps did, we recently conducted a political economy analysis in the Karamoja region of Uganda, and I've also just now started a climate security assessment that's actually being piloted as we speak. And the political economy analysis, looked a bit further back in terms of what's been going on, and it found that there's been a really uneven recovery from the COVID pandemic in what was already a fragile environment, and that combined with climate change and crime, stoked by communal tensions that all impacted food security, had an impact on food security. So, going back to 2019, we saw increasing livestock theft, sparked conflict in Karamoja. Then you had locust attacks and failed harvests, increasing the economic pressure on the community. And then when COVID-19 hits, that forced the closure of livestock markets and imposed lockdowns. And so young people resorting more to raiding activities, further increasing this criminal activity and leading to more intercommunal conflict. So we see this connection there that we're all familiar with. And this political economy analysis all kind of really lays it out. But going deeper, the climate security assessment I mentioned now is using the same system level approach, looking across these factors of climate, conflict, and food security, among others, but is really grounded in a local reality so that it can be applied in programming. The lessons can be applied. So I mentioned before many of these negative compounding effects between climate change and conflict, these environmental factors, but the climate security assessment also uncovered opportunities to capitalize on. So for example, one thing we heard was how climate change and climate disasters had led some families to seek alternative livelihoods to diversify their incomes in the face of these challenges. And in some cases, that meant sending their children to school instead of to work. So, and this was the case even for some of our colleagues who said that this had happened to them as children going a bit further back. So you can try and build programming around positive coping mechanisms like this, that in this case, strengthen education and the overall prospects for the community. In addition, we heard that several communities who received financial support to invest in market activities, we saw a challenge here, but one that we thought there was an opportunity to address, which was that the communities who received the support, a lot of them felt unable to participate because they were afraid to travel to other areas. And this was because of a general fear of insecurity and conflict in the area. However, we saw that some of the trade routes they could use were actually relatively safe, and that if communities had access to more reliable security information and conflict data, they could identify areas and trade routes that are safe to travel on and have increased opportunities for trade. So there's a way that you can use the peace building lens and the peace and conflict approach to try and support resilience in the face of climate disasters and for food security. So ultimately, we see, in this complex context where one factor, be it climate, conflict, or food security, has an impact on the entire ecosystem, and we need to rethink our initiatives to operate across that system to promote overall resilience.
Thank you. So then moving on, in terms of you've highlighted a few in terms of the collaboration that you've seen already, but what other successes have you seen either in Mercy Corps' work around bringing these three areas together of food security, climate, and environment? Conflict and environment. What do you think are some of the things that have led to that successful collaboration?
Yeah, I can share a couple of examples. I mean, starting specifically on the conflict and food security intersection, one of the programs Mercy Corps implemented was called the Food Security, it has a long title, Food Security and Inclusive Access to Resources for Conflict Sensitive Market Development. That's a mouthful, but we called it the FARM program. And this was in Eastern Congo, and it integrated food security and peace programming. And Mercy Corps collaborated with Search for Common Ground across these two sectors. And what we saw in Eastern Congo, and many people see, is that access to land, or rather lack of access to land, is a crucial factor, both in terms of food insecurity and conflict. It's high, and they're highly related, but through that issue of land access. And so the FARM program covered a wide range of areas from the food security and peace and conflict realms. And part of what it did through negotiation and dialogue platforms and collective land titling was able to double land access in areas where the program worked. I think from 42% to 84% of respondents saying that they had access to land they could work on. And this led to people feeling much more hopeful about the prospects for stability in their community and their own prospects. And that was important in terms of their confidence, both for peace in the area, but also for longer term economic growth and food security, even in the face of climate change. And another one I can mention, returning to the example of the context in Uganda, is that in the Karamoja region, Mercy Corps implements a program called ECISIL. And that program strengthens formal and informal natural resource management structures that are really facing these pressures related to climate change. And ECISIL implemented a series of climate risk management actions that enabled these formal and informal institutions to peacefully oversee and share communal natural resources. And that included developing community and government level agreements, policies, and resource management processes. And these interventions increased livestock value. They strengthened the management and productivity of livestock watering sites. They reduced this intercommunal tension over resources, improve access to land. And these overall conditions are obviously very positive in terms of people's livelihoods, but also in terms of the stability and the opportunities for peace in the area. So those are some of the ways we approach this problem.
Thank you. It sounds some really interesting stuff. So what do you see then as the most critical coordination gaps in the programming that you've done, and with who?
Yeah, I think in different areas, the ideal learning brief we started by discussing highlighted a lot of gaps in terms of on the conflict sensitivity side, in terms of sharing resources and combining efforts on conflict sensitivity across different organizations. So we talked about the importance of analysis. Well, how often is that shared? And there are challenges to doing so we can go into, but that's one of the challenges in coordination in terms of working together on conflict sensitivity in particular. There are efforts to address that, but it's a challenge. There are also challenges in terms of coordination within organizations around conflict sensitivity. So for example, creating a culture in an organization where staff feel like they can discuss these issues and address them. So for example, how do, sometimes you have a situation where staff who are very much on the ground and face-to-face with communities feel like it's tricky for them to raise concerns and raise problems to their management all the time, because they feel like it might be seen as they're kind of highlighting they're highlighting failings that may be attributed to them, or they might seem to be kind of rocking the boat. So you need to encourage that culture of openness to say, no, you can share these issues, and management needs to be in a position where they feel like they're ready to hear that and adapt the programs in response. So there's a coordination within organizations too on this. So I think that those are some of the coordination gaps we see, and something we may discuss later as well. I think that we had talked about before was in terms of language, and it's kind of that technical expertise, and Carl was talking about that a little bit as well. And I think that there's this issue that actors in these different sectors, we have our own terminology, we have our own areas that we focus on, and so it can be hard to understand one another sometimes, and thereby integrate our programs. So I think that kind of bridging that gap is important as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ted. So for the next 25 minutes, if I've got my timings right, everything's in US times and I'm in Europe. So I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's the right time. Anyway, for the next 25 minutes, I wanted to, we've got a few questions for the panel, but I also wanted to open it up to the participants for any other questions that you might have or reactions to key points from Ted or Carl. Please do drop them into the chat or raise your hand, and I'll come to you. And thank you for sharing the link, Ted. If there aren't any immediate questions, then I will circle back to Carl. I wanted to ask you a very similar question to the one that to the second to last one that I asked Ted, in terms of the successes that you've seen in integrating climate and conflict work. I'd be interested to hear from you at some of the experiences that you've had where those you've seen that action and people moving away from that focus on definitions into something that has been integrated in the field in a more cohesive and comprehensive way without focusing on the definitions.
I'm laughing a little because there was just a thematic review that the UN Peacebuilding Fund, really the Peacebuilding Support Office, published on climate security and peacebuilding. And I'll drop the link into the chat here. But this came out just weeks ago, a couple weeks ago. It's, I would commend it to your attention. One of the interesting things that came out of that is that of the 74 projects that were on climate security and environmental peace building, there were only about 43 that really dealt with climate security. And even those had a wide range of understanding of what climate security is. Now, for those who don't know, the UN Peacebuilding Fund provides support to countries to help prevent conflict. Sometimes it's a prevention of relapse, sometimes it's a prevention of just sliding into conflict in the first place. And they, through the climate security mechanism, have provided support to a lot of different projects. And taking a step back and looking at all these different projects, they found that some of these really were designed as with climate security in mind. In others, climate security was just added to as a way of getting the funding. And one of the most interesting aspects was that a lot of these projects were maybe at their heart gender empowerment projects that became gender empowerment in the context of climate security, and make sure that women had a voice, had agency, were able to undertake certain actions to reduce the climate impacts. So, but I think that you'll never get away from the definitional fights. But they did find a wide range of interesting aspects, and some of them being more transboundary, some of them being more local level. And so there were quite a few different projects that were highlighted there. A separate one, which I would note that UNEP undertook in the Wadi El Ku area. This is kind of a classic environmental cooperation around shared interests in the environment. In this case, water shortages and vulnerability, and they built a kind of a weir of sorts. So when in the rainy season, when the water comes, it gets caught, and there's a lake, and it's a temporary lake, but they're able to use the water longer. And they brought together different groups who didn't really trust one another, but they had a shared interest in this. I thought that was a very exciting example of how these projects can work. But for those who are interested in what works and what works better on climate security, I would look at the thematic review that's in the link here.
Thank you, Carl. So one of the participants has posted a question in the chat. Based on your experience, to what extent are local CSOs or grassroots organizations highlighting the need to focus on dealing with climate to usher in peace? And I'll pose that question first to Carl, and then I'll follow up with Ted.
I hear about this a certain amount from the environmental organizations who I think that there is a lot of organizations when you're in a very vulnerable situation, whether you're in conflict, you're just out of conflict, that the environmental organizations often find it necessary to frame their activities to support the peace agenda. And I also believe it, but it's often a way also of kind of ensuring the relevance of their activities. I don't hear as much about this from the local peace NGOs. And I'm curious what Ted's experience is on the humanitarian side. How much are the local humanitarian organizations, not the big ones like Mercy Corps, but kind of the local ones, how much are they pushing for climate action when there are all these other priorities? And I think it's interesting to think about where those voices are coming from, not just at what scale, but what's the value orientation, if you will.
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in there. I mean, I think to answer the overall question and then get back to what you mentioned, Carl, in particular, I would say I think we see this quite a bit. And we had the question before that Celestine asked about coordination gaps. And we often see when we're trying to work across different technical sectors in the aid world, we're talking about working across the humanitarian development peace nexus, for example, and breaking down these silos. I think many years seeing more and more that the key to doing that is to rely more and empower local actors more, who don't operate necessarily in these silos, whose focus is on a specific community and whatever the challenges may be there, and seeing those issues holistically. And I think that's been our experience as well in this space with local organizations who really see the connection between climate and conflict. And just on that last point, Carl, I mean, and kind of coming to this question, our experience is that when we look at this issue, it's partly about how do we deal with climate to usher in peace, because of how climate change and environmental factors are driving conflict. But it works the other way around as well, which is that you need to build in peace to address climate change, that communities that are divided or where there's ineffective or dysfunctional governance and those relationships are not working, are not able to adapt to climate changes effectively. And so it really does go both ways. And I think that's what we're seeing as well. And yeah, so I think maybe I'll leave it there.
Thank you. That's really poignant in terms of that connection to local organizations. I think there's in various places, I think we've seen different responses to this, where especially as NDCs, nationally determined contributions, and also the national adaptation plans are kicking in. I often see that they're not actually being translated down to what communities are thinking about that. So especially community-based organizations. So a second question that's come up then is, conversely, in addition to the first question on CSOs, this is from the same participant, climate change is a long-term issue that needs major commitment. Have you seen a change in the investment from donors regarding pre-climate crisis, early warning systems, and supporting appropriate legislation with government partners? Sorry, Ted, I'll let you go first, and then I'll switch back to Carl.
Yeah, no, I think we have seen a change. I think the more and more we see increasing interest from donors in this area, and you know, in terms of these are maybe the two key challenges facing the world today. In climate, we've seen for many years a rise in climate over the in conflict, a rise in conflict over the past 10 years. People affected by it, people displaced, the people who are suffering violence because of it, and how this is really driving the majority of humanitarian needs. And we all know that the long-term challenge around climate change and how this is our greatest existential risk. And so I think the combination of these two factors is becoming more and more clear, and we've seen that reflected from donors. But as we said, I think that there's still that challenge in how are you integrating different facets of programming to respond to them together. That's kind of the next step. So I think the understanding of the challenges there, being able to finance the response, and with funding systems that are still somewhat separate, is a remaining challenge.
And Carl?
Yes, it is a challenge. I think one of the things that we don't talk about enough is Catherine Wong at UNDP and her colleagues have done some very interesting analysis about adaptation and climate finance and peace and conflict. And one of the things that they found is that in fragile states, it's about almost $9 per person in climate finance from vertical funds. You compare that with $162 per person, almost 20 times as much per person for non-fragile states. And I think that one of the things this highlights is fragility and conflict make for very uncertain circumstances when you're investing. And I'm not talking just investment for profit, but investing in impact. And there are different priorities and everything else. And so I think that these ideas, you know, yes, all of this is, these are, you know, people are talking about it, but when you come down to it, there still is very modest funding in fragile states vis-a-vis non-fragile states. And so, you know, have we seen changes in investment? You know, yes, we have. But the other part of this, which I think is interesting, and it's really hard to track, is, okay, so let's suppose you develop your plan, you develop your legislation. How do you know if the legislation is being implemented and enforced? And well, I mean, I say this as somebody who specializes in that. And the truth is, there aren't good metrics for environmental compliance and enforcement. And there are problems with metrics that people propose, like, well, how many cases were brought? Well, you know, what happens if you're just bringing a lot of little cases, and the big ones that take a lot of time and energy, you know, if you count the number of cases, that, you know, is a disincentive to bring big heavy cases that will have the real impact. So there are all sorts of challenges, and UNEP is trying to do this because they've seen that we've adopted all this environmental legislation, so really since largely since the 1992 Earth Summit, and that there are problems with compliance enforcement. So they have this focus on what they call the environmental rule of law. And the question is, how do you track that? What are the indicators? Well, okay, so it's easy to say who has what laws or who has what provisions, but how do you know, how do you track if it's being implemented and enforced? Because the other part of that you have kind of the inputs, the actions, and then you also have questions around, well, what's the state of the environment, and is it improving? Is it degrading in that particular context? And sometimes that's due to failure to enforce. Sometimes it's due to just economics. Sometimes it's due to other factors. And so I think one of the biggest challenges that we see in the governance side is an inability to really track whether things are being implemented and enforced. It's easier to say, oh, we now have a law on this, or we have a national adaptation plan. So what?
Thank you. So another question in the chat, we talked about breaking down silos and speaking in common language in this space. How do you think that data and artificial intelligence can contribute to making these connections?
Let me type this question into ChatGPT. Seriously though, I think that we need to develop a more common language, a more common understanding that draws upon the data. But I don't know how just having the data, I think the data can help us to see links. In AI, there are all sorts of things that AI can do in terms of early warning or helping us to monitor situations. But I think that a lot of this is more at the conceptual stage, and data doesn't do, it's not, that's good more for testing your concepts and for seeing where the world's going, at least as I see it. But quite relevant to M&E.
I'd be interested, Ted, for your thoughts on this, because I think that Mercy Corps does quite a lot of using of data in order to inform how you approach things.
Yeah, we do. And so we have a crisis analytics department that does use big data as well as part of its overall kind of scanning of different landscapes to see where the risks are and adapt our programs based on that. But I also want to mention something, again, coming from the learning brief, specifically in this space, about where that's coming from the food security side. And so I believe it's WFP is one organization, for example, that uses extremely large data sets and predictive analytics for some of their context analysis, and they have an integrated context analysis initiative that I think, as they put it, strengthens the design, planning, and implementation of longer-term resilience building programs developed in partnership and aligned to national and local priorities. So I think that in a lot of these different sectors, there are these kinds of efforts, and one of the questions is going to be how to connect them, and how can you leverage one for the other without diluting them too much, so that you're not able to go in depth in your conflict analysis or in depth in food security analysis. But maybe that's where ChatGPT can help as well.
I think it's also potentially the fact that data can help bring together the conflict data side of things, which often is not overlapped with the scientific data of the kind of frames climate change. So it could be that there's room to develop at least more of a trend and understanding of the ground context based on that, which might help then at least the scientific world and social scientists kind of perhaps talk in more of the same language. That's to be seen.
Sorry, if I may.
Yeah, please.
This is actually an area that ELI and the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, with support from USIP, have been working on a toolkit on monitoring and evaluation of environmental peace building. And we struggle a lot with this question of, you have a lot of data that can help you track how the environment changes, for better or for worse. You know, ground cover, water, access to water, whatever it is, livelihoods. And then you have a lot of data on whether we're, how's peace, fragility, conflict. And you can see over time in a particular place that maybe where you're working on forest livelihoods. So you can see that forest livelihoods have grown. At the same time, peace has grown. Question is, how much of that reduction in conflict or growth in peace may be attributed or related to your efforts, and how much was it just, your efforts were enabled because there was peace, because there was more peace? And trying to connect these data sets, I think that's where life gets very tricky. And I think one of the specific ways that we see that's done is usually through perceptions and narratives and interviews. So it might be surveys as to, do you trust people more? And does that have to do with this or this or this? But trying to get beyond correlation to causation, and which way does the causal arrow flow on these things? Because it may be that the increase in peace actually is making possible the increases in environmental status, not the other way around, which was your whole theory of change. So again, data is really important, but we want to be careful about making sure that the data says what we think it says. And I think that the mixed methods is really important there, getting in some of the qualitative aspects.
We've got time for one more question before I close. So Carl, earlier you highlighted that there's a key question for the field of resolving some of these definitional and conceptual debates. Do you have any thoughts on the best methods for conclusive resolution? Is it successful programs? Is it academic study? Is it more grassroots input? What would you suggest as some of the ways forward on this?
I love this question. I think that this question mixes a couple things, because there's kind of a definitional question around, and part of that's how broadly or narrowly does the community want to define this field. But then there's the question of what are the modalities by which it works. So it's like physics. What is physics? And then the other question being is, how does physics work? Those are two separate questions. They're related, but they're separate. And I think that best methods for, how do you do environmental peace building? Well, that's going to be, trial and error, monitoring evaluation, getting a large enough data set, all of that. So I think that that's important. I think that the question of, at least, first of all, I think that the whole resolving the definitional or conceptual debate. I think that to a certain extent is not the right question. I think the question is, how do we improve our definitions and our conceptual understandings? This is an ongoing process. It is an adaptive and iterative process. And so I don't know that we necessarily get a resolution. It's like, how do we get to a good definition and a good understanding? Then how do we improve it? And how do we improve it? Without necessarily being locked into what a particular definition is. One question which I didn't mention, but it's been on my mind for a little while, is how does environmental peace building work differently for social conflicts? Most of my work is around violent and armed conflicts, and but the sorts of the grievances that you see in social conflicts around inequitable allocation, inequitable burdens, exclusionary practices, and the solutions that are proposed of inclusion, equity, benefit sharing. There's a lot that's very, very similar. And you see a lot of people, a lot of anthropologists in particular, working more on social conflicts and environmental peace building and social conflicts. And I'm very curious, does the nature of the conflict have a meaningful difference on how we go about environmental peace building? It seems obvious that it would, but when you start actually talking about the details, I struggle. It feels like there are other dimensions, like, well, how do you manage ex-combatants or things like that? But there's a lot that's very similar. And so I think that the best way to approach this is, first of all, it's a consultative process. It takes some time to talk to a lot of different people and make sure it's not just Northerners. I think there's a lot of capacity in the South, and making sure that those voices are involved early on. I would also say, to the extent possible, at different disciplines, as many different disciplines as possible, different scales. And then I think the next question is, what do you do with all that information, with all those different perspectives? And it may be that, something that's very general that people can agree on, or that there are some different clusters, different nodes, and maybe that you align yourself with those. But then the next question that Jordan's getting at here is, you need to be doing things and feeding back in. And I think this is this field is really dynamic because it is at that intersection of theory and practice. You have a lot of practitioners and you have a lot of researchers, and the practitioners in many cases are out in front of the researchers. They're doing it, they're trying things, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And with that, I think one of the things we really need to be better at is, how do we capture not only the innovations and the successes, but the failures? And there's real reputational risk and funding implications that comes with failure. And so there are some epic failures that we know about because they're part of the lore that you talk about when you sit down for beer. But a lot of it, but you don't have the details, and they're not in any sort of peer-reviewed or reliable source. And so there's always questions about, how do we learn from this? How do we actually get a sense? There are fail fests that have been done in different contexts, but I think this question of how do we continue to learn is really important.
Thank you very much. I do want to come to you, Ted, but I'm also conscious that we've got very limited time left. So Ted, if you could, and Maybeen has also got a question. So perhaps Ted, if you could respond and keep it brief, and then Maybeen, I'll come to you for a last question.
I'm happy to go to Maybeen if you like, seeing as the time is tight.
Perfect. All right. Maybeen?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I'm with the Halo Trust, and we do humanitarian demining. And what we've found a lot is that we focus on demining agricultural lands because we found that not being able to access land because of landmine contamination is really a driver of food insecurity. But from there, once that land is cleared, other actors can kind of step in and help communities redevelop that agriculture in a sustainable and like climate resilient way. So I was wondering if any of you have any thoughts on like directly folding environmental peace building and climate resilience into like a post-conflict cleanup scenario.
Ted, maybe I can give you that question.
Sorry, and I missed the end of the question. It got choppy for me. Could you just repeat that? Sorry.
Yeah, so sorry about that. I was asking about if you have any thoughts on directly folding environmental peace building and climate resilience into post-conflict cleanup and kind of like encouraging communities to build back with more resilience.
Yeah, I think that when we look at that, it's interesting you talk about it from kind of a post-conflict context. I mean, the kinds of programs that we've been managing in this space are often in the midst of conflict, and it's on that kind of continuum, sort of the one that Carl presented, but it's not really that post-conflict phase quite as much. The work in Karamoja, it's ongoing, or in other areas where we work, it's sort of ongoing, and you're folding it in. But I think that what we see is that you're trying to fold them all together. The work, you know, it tends to be focused, for instance, on natural resource management. You're folding together, therefore, elements around adapting to climate change, securing livelihoods and food security and peace building. You're bringing them together for the overall wider resilience. So in that respect, it's kind of relevant through all the different phases of conflict.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, we're at time. I do want to thank all of the participants for joining today and the panelists. It's been really interesting listening to you all and hearing your thoughts on this really complex area. And thank you very much for being part of PeaceCon this year. I hope you have good sessions as you move on into tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.